Good evening. Good to have you with us for our adult Bible class this evening. I am not making excuses. Is that too loud? It's okay. I'm not making excuses, but I found out I was going to do this class about 45 minutes ago. And so if it's a horrible class, that's my excuse. If it's great, you can say, man, he is a talented guy. No, I'm just kidding. It is good to have you with us. We are in Romans chapter 14. And before we begin, we are talking about sick folks who need to be remembered in our prayers. And so one of those is Cordell Isaac, who's still not doing well, Joanne. Cordell still not doing well. Keep Cordell in your prayers. Bobby Tipton, the reason I'm here is he's found out he has cellulitis and had to stay home. And so we want Bob to get better. Who else? Let me see my list here. Billy, how you, Billy? You're not good. You're not good. I mean, you're good, but you're not doing well. May the 9th for consultation with the surgeon. All right. Judy Cockrell. Jerry. Hilda. What is her name now? Donathan. Yeah, I'll start calling her Hilda Willis. Hilda is taking chemo, isn't she now, for cancer. And so keep Jerry's sister Hilda in your prayers. Who else? Doug? Yeah. Sandy Neal is married to Mike Cockrell. She's Sandy Cockrell now, and her husband Mike is not doing well. Sandy was my girlfriend in the 9th grade. She was. And who does? Oh, yeah. Oh, Doug, yeah. Doug Weaver's son, Matthew. Lisa's son is and what's the matter with him? Oh, my. I've known him his whole life. Yeah. Doug and Lisa Weaver, who attend down at West Main, their son, Matthew, has some spots on his brain. What else? Judy? And what's her name? Delmer Wayne in Atlanta, Judy's friend. So keep that name in your mind as we pray. And what else? Temple? Okay, Wanda Bertrand. Wanda Huff. Wanda Bertrand Huff. And Philip Donaldson's daughter had serious surgery. Okay, and who else? Let me. I'm sorry, James, I didn't hear a thing you said. I'm so sorry. Oh, Dimitri Overstreet. And what about him? Oh, they have hospice with Dimitri now? Oh, my. Jonelle's son, she's a member here, and he is too. He's not able to come, but he was restored recently, Dimitri Overstreet, and they've called in hospice on him. Oh, my. What a serious thing. Yeah, I see Wanda Bertram Huff on the list now. And Darrell Kimbrell received good news. He's cancer-free. Gary Lacey continues to make remarkable recovery with his liver transplant. And you can see on your list, there are several others there. Jimmy Weber had brain surgery, and we met with him, Dan and I did the other day, had a good talk with him, and he's doing about like he ought to be doing after having the kind of surgery he had. And so we'll have keep him in our prayers as well. Kenny, would you lead us, please? Amen. Thank you, Ken. Romans chapter 14. Put your finger there and flip over to 1 Corinthians 6 first. 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 12 to set the stage for Romans, what we're going to be talking about. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful or expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. Now skip on over to 1 Corinthians 10:23 and notice that Paul says something very similar to that again, same author. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean that it's always wise to exercise that right. You get that, right? You understand that there are some things that I'm allowed to do that would hurt my Christian influence if I were to do them in front of certain people. There are some things that would not be sinful in some situation unless it caused a weaker brother or sister to stumble. If I were in the presence of a new Christian who thought that the dietary laws of the Old Testament were still in effect, and I ate a big ham sandwich unnecessarily, that would offend that person. So what do? Well, I don't eat ham that day. I just don't eat it as long as that person's around. Did it hurt me? Well, no, I'll get ham some other place, some other time. Did it help him? Maybe. Would it hurt him had I done the other? Yes. And that's Romans 14 in a nutshell. There are things that chapter 1 of verse 14, receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things. For one believes he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. Now skip over to chapter 15 and verse 1. We then who are strong ought to bear with the weaknesses of the weak, and not to please ourselves. Is that a tough lesson for Americans? We're really big on liberty, aren't we? We're really big on, I have the right to do that. Yeah, you probably do. There's absolutely nothing illegal about it. That's probably true too. But is it going to help or hurt an individual on his journey to heaven? Christians, that's your key. That's your top priority. Is this behavior going to help or hurt somebody going to heaven? I don't believe there's a thing in the world wrong with eating a bourbon ball from Ruth Hunter's. I don't. But if I were with a Christian who said, that's got the name bourbon in it, and you might better watch that. Bernice, they took me to Cattleman's one time. And what was it I got? It had whiskey in the name. Yeah, it had moonshine chicken. That's what it was. I got moonshine chicken. I was in a gospel meeting over in Clay City, and Terry brought it up. And he said, man, you ought to seen that preacher eat that moonshine chicken. Said, boy, he huffed it down. Well, we were joking. We were playing. But if it actually offended somebody to eat something with moonshine in the name of it, it didn't actually have alcohol in it. But if that offended somebody, then I need to abstain from it, don't I? That's what Romans 14 is about. We had a preacher when I was a boy at Oak Hill who wouldn't drink root beer for that reason. It had the word beer in the name of it. He was afraid somebody might think he was drinking beer, and so he wouldn't do it. Now, are those silly extremes? In some situations they might be, but not if they're going to cause somebody to stumble. It wouldn't. Okay? So, let's get into Romans 14 unless you have comments. Yes? Devil. Yeah. There you go. Well, that's a good idea. That nothing. Don't give him any more credit than you have to. Don't give him any publicity. So maybe we ought to eat something called devil's food cake, something else. Oh, Virginia, you got your hand up. You ought to do it. Yeah. We're actually going to deal with that as we go along. But there are some who struggle with eating in the same building where you worship, and there are some who struggle with having more than one communion cup. It offends them. There are some who don't like Bible class or don't believe in Bible classes, or helping orphans' homes out of the church treasury, or helping non-Christians out of the church treasury. All of those things have been causes of division, I believe, unnecessarily. Now, there is this thing to where being a weak brother can become an excuse for getting your way. And I'm not being unkind. I have seen brethren who had plenty of time to mature say, you can't do that, it offends my conscience, and you can't offend the weak brother. Well, you've been a Christian for 40 years. I would hesitate to categorize you as a weak brother. If you are, then you needed to grow. You should have grown. And so there are those who use the weak brother argument to stop the work of the church and control the work of the church. You can't let that happen. You can't let the weaknesses of a new Christian stop the church in its tracks to where you can't do anything. And that's what you're talking about. That happens sometimes. And so we deal with those things the way Paul said. Let's do what Paul said, and let's see what he said. Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things. One believes he may eat all things. He who is weak eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, but let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. Who are you to judge another's servants? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord. And he who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks. And he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat and gives God thanks. And then verse 7, none of us lives to himself or dies unto himself. The whole point of all this is they're in a transitional period in religious history when many converts to Christ were passing from one great system, the Mosaic system, into another great system, the Christian system. And anytime you have a major transition, you're going to have what? Glitches. Yeah, you're going to have a glitch every now and then. Any kind of major transition. So Judaism had been the way for 1,500 years. Christianity is the way when Paul's writing this. There are going to be some transitions. You remember in Acts 15 when the brethren at Antioch were being required to be circumcised? And you remember that Paul and the others went down to Jerusalem to ask the apostles what to do about that. And what did they say? They said, no, we're under a different law. You don't have to do that. Don't bind those things on them anymore. And so, because of the diverse religious and cultural backgrounds, both Jews and Gentiles, problems arose, and it threatened the unity of the body. Do you think we take unity and division seriously enough sometimes in the church? I think we divide too easily. I don't think we strive, and I'm saying we, I know that's a broad generalization, probably not you individually, but my experience in the church, I've never been part of any other church other than the Church of Christ. I was taken to Oak Hill when I was an infant, and I was baptized when I was 12, and so I don't really know much else, but I do know the church, and what I've seen in the church is unnecessary division over matters of opinion and over weaker brethren controlling stronger brethren and vice versa. And so what Paul says here is there are several principles here. He contrasts those who are weak with those who are strong. And he says, have compassion for the weak. Don't just unnecessarily, frivolously flaunt things in front of them that you're allowed to do if you know it's going to cause problems. But then to the weak, he says, you might think a little bit about the fact that this guy's been in the church a long time. And he knows what he's doing. And maybe you could learn from him rather than criticize him. Maybe you could learn from them rather than divide the Lord's body. I heard an old preacher, I like preachers and I collect their thoughts as often as I can, and I have for a long time. And I heard an old preacher say one time, I would as soon sever my arm from my body as to be guilty of dividing the church. Now, he's taking unity seriously, isn't he? That's serious. And so unity is what Paul's talking about. That's the thing. But notice some of the specifics. First of all, what you can eat and what you can't eat. Why was that a big deal? There were dietary restrictions.
God had cleansed everything. He showed it to Peter when you let the sheep down that had all four of the beasts and all.
That's right.
Take and eat.
That's right. What Donnie said, if you didn't hear him back there, is in the Old Testament there were dietary restrictions. There were some things that weren't clean. You weren't allowed to eat them. But when Peter saw that vision of the sheep coming down, and in Acts chapter 10 and 11, when he saw that vision coming down, he said, I perceive now that everything's clean. It's all clean. And so now, in the New Testament, in the church, you can eat whatever you want to. I knew a guy that barbecued a muskrat one time. I didn't eat it. Looked too much like a rat to me. But I don't guess it was unclean religiously, barbecued muskrat, but I'd have to be awful hungry before I eat that. But anyway, nothing is unclean now. And so can you see the clash that would cause? I've never eaten anything common or unclean.
That's what Peter told.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
said, not so, Lord, nothing unclean is
I never have. And God said, don't call what I've made clean common or unclean. Now, do you have the right to abstain from those things? Yeah, and I'm glad you do, because I don't want to eat muskrat. I'm glad I have the right to do that. I don't want to eat possum either. I can tell you some stories where I've seen them before. But anyway, you have the right to abstain from that, or you have the right to partake of it without dividing the church over it. So the first thing he talks about are dietary restrictions. And he says, one believes he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. Wayne Jackson, out in Stockton, California, good preacher, great prolific writer, wrote a treatise one time about vegetarian snobs, which I thought was interesting. If you're a vegetarian, God love you. Have at it. Eat all the grass you want to eat. That's all right with me. All the vegetables you want to eat. That's fine. I like a big piece of red meat every now and then. I don't believe either one of us is going to go to hell over there. I don't. I believe that's what Paul's saying. And yet, there seems to be this among some, not you, but among some, I'm a vegetarian. You got that hamburger juice running down your jaw. I'm a vegetarian. I ain't going to touch you. You know.
If you violate your conscience, you better think about it long and hard and decide where you are.
Yeah, and that's what verse 21 through 23 talks about when we get down there. Don't do it if you're not sure about it. If you're not to the point, that's the point of the weak brother and the strong brother. If you're not strong enough, if you haven't matured to the point that you get it, it doesn't bother you, then don't do it. Abstain from it. But Paul just finished saying, don't judge or condemn your brother because he is to the point that it doesn't bother him. He is to the point that it's okay. Don't think of yourself as being more holy than him. Just say, you know what, I'm not there yet. I'm not ready to eat in the church building yet. We had a preacher one time in a place who didn't believe in eating in the church building, but he would come and preach for us, and when we had meals, he would very tactfully and diplomatically excuse himself. I don't have a problem with that. He never once stood up and said, you people are going to hell for that. He just said, I'm not going to participate in it. Okay, Kenny? Yeah. Yeah. That's a fact. And that's where you cross the line. There are things that I like that you don't like. There are things you like for which I do not care. I do not particularly have a love for. But when I start making my likes and my opinions God's law, then I've crossed the line. Look at Matthew 16. Let me show you a little something if I've got it right in my head. When Jesus said in Matthew 16, 18, and 19, very interesting. He said, I say to you, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Now, Matthew 16, 19. I'll give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Now, here's how this should be translated, and some of your translations have it. The King James misses it a little bit, I think. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you bind on earth will have already been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will have already been loosed in heaven. That's what it says in the original. Now, why is that different than what it says here? Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Because if you have in your mind, I have the keys to the kingdom, I have the means of entry into the kingdom. If I am a faithful citizen of God's kingdom, I am not going to bind anything that hasn't already been bound in heaven. And I'm not going to loose anything that hasn't already been loosed in heaven. I'm only going to do what heaven allows me to do. And so that's exactly what Kenny's talking about. There are things that people bind. They make binding law that God didn't make binding law. Here's a saying. I don't know how you feel about this. I don't even know how I feel about it, to be honest with you. But when it comes to religious matters, when it comes to the New Testament, it is often said lawmakers are lawbreakers. Now, what they mean by that is, if you make laws that God didn't already make, that's a violation of the law. Because the law says you don't add to it or take away from it. And so lawmakers are, in a sense, lawbreakers because they've added laws that God didn't add. Okay? The next thing that he talks about is, and I love verse 3, you need to really have that in your mind. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat. I believe there are brethren who despise anybody that disagrees with them. I think I've seen it. I think I've seen hatred among brethren because you don't agree on where you can eat and where you can't, and what you can do and what you can't do. I hope that's not the case, but I believe I've seen it. Now, let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. Who are you to judge another servant? We're God's servants. To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God's able to make him stand. Now that's eating. Here are several scenarios with eating. One is you come out of the old law. You were a Jew. You obeyed the gospel. You're still hanging on to the old law dietary laws. You have a Gentile brother who knows nothing of those laws. They don't mean anything to him. You two got to figure out how to get along. You got to figure out how to get along. The second thing that they were confronted with, and he talks about it in some of his other letters, is the Gentiles thought that meat offered to idols was sacred. And to the Jews, those idols didn't mean anything to them. It was just a good cut of meat to them. And so had it been offered to an idol and then sold in the marketplace, and somebody bought it and set it before guests who knew it had been offered to idols, it could violate the conscience of one who thought it was something, thought it was holy meat. But to those of us who know that an idol is nothing, as Paul said in more than one place, an idol is nothing, it's just meat to us. They used it in their religious ceremony, then they sold it in the marketplace. It's just a good choice cut of meat. And so you have to balance that. The second thing that he talks about is holy days. Did the Jews have holy days? Yeah, they did. Sabbath, for one, every Saturday. Is Saturday a special holy day for you? No. If a Jewish brother saw you working physical work on Saturday, it would offend him until he grew to the point of understanding that that's not binding anymore. Do we struggle with these sacred days and holy days in our culture? Maybe not as much as we once did. I know a lot of people still who believe it's a sin to work on Sunday. They say that's the Christian Sabbath. Do I believe you ought to have a day of rest? Do I think it's physically and spiritually beneficial? Yes. Could I bind that on you and tell you you can't go to your job on Sunday afternoon, although it doesn't keep you from worshiping Sunday morning or Sunday night? Could I bind? No. And I better not bind it. In fact, Sunday was not made a holiday with days off from work until the 300s with Constantine. So for 300 years after Christ, people worked on Sunday and still worshiped. They went to their jobs and worked their work around their worship. And so don't get into that thing. But there is just a general principle that one day of rest every week is good for you. That's just a good physical and spiritual principle. It doesn't hurt you to lay off for that one day and just think about spiritual things. Brother Cogdell, Roy Cogdell, who wrote the popular book New Testament Church, a little book about that thick with all kinds of things about the church in it, and probably one of the most popular about that subject. He believed that you couldn't play. You couldn't play ball. You couldn't recreate. You couldn't do anything except holy things on Sunday. He believed that. Had it in his book. He didn't like picnics and ball games and those kinds of things, carnivals and those kind of things, even if they didn't keep you from the worship service. He believed that whole day should be. Well, that's his opinion. He's allowed to do that. Yeah. No. Tact and diplomacy and love go a long way in situations like this. And the way you approach. If you didn't hear Jeff, he said you have to be careful how you handle these things. You don't just go up to somebody who is binding a law that the Bible doesn't bind, or is loosing something or doing something that violates your conscience. You don't go up and just blast them out of the water, because you're not going to keep your brother that way. The very thing Paul deals with here, that's exactly what Paul wants to accomplish, is unity in these situations. Now, here's what we're not talking about. We're not talking about compromising the truth. We're talking about matters of expediency, matters of opinion, matters of culture. And that's what Paul deals with here. Now, he talks about holy days. Verse 5, one person esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. And then verse 6, they each observe to the Lord, and he adds eating in there. He who observes, verse 6, the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day to the Lord does not observe it. He who eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks, but he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat, but he gives God thanks anyway. He's still thankful. He's just not eating this meal as a holy thing. And Paul, boy, I want you to memorize verse 7. Mark it. If you got a Bible too good to mark in, you got too good a Bible. Mark verse 7 in your Bible, because it says, no man lives or dies to himself. What does that tell you? We've got to figure out a way to get along if we're going to get to heaven without compromising truth. We must figure out how to unite in spite of these things, what you eat and what you don't eat, and those kinds of what days. The day that I have seen Christians struggle with is December 25th. I know Christians who believe it's absolute blasphemy to set that day aside and to celebrate it in any way, shape, or form with a family feast. Had one in a congregation where I was at one time, and he came to my house and saw a tree with lights on it and presents under it. I thought the top was going to blow out of his head. But calmed him down, and he explained to me. He said, I don't celebrate that day. We don't do anything to do with that time of year. And I happened to know where he worked. And I said, do you take the day off with pay? Well, yeah. That's all I had to say. That's an inconsistency, isn't it? I'd let me work if I believed in it that strongly. If you believe in it that strongly, I'm not making fun of you. I'm not telling you you're wrong. If you don't want anything, you know what? If I didn't have a wife and children and grandchildren, you know what I'd do on December 25th? I'd go to Florida and lay on the beach. I would. I wouldn't fix those big meals. I wouldn't spend all that money on them presents. I wouldn't do it. But I have a family. And that's what they like to do. And I love them. And so that's what we're going to do as a family. Not as Jesus' birthday. I think Jesus was born in April myself, but that's my opinion. And I don't think he was born in December. And so I don't celebrate it as his birthday, but I am a citizen of the United States, and it's a national holiday, and I like to get together with my family and eat every now and then, and so that's a good thing. And if it makes them happy to do that and to have presents, then that's our culture, that's our tradition. Nothing wrong with that. But Paul says here, some people esteem one day alike. Some people think one day is very special, some don't. And nobody lives or dies to himself, so you're going to have to figure out how to work it out. He says if we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. That's the main thing. That's the umbrella under which we all find ourselves if we're children of God, if we're Christians, isn't it? We find ourselves, we all belong to God. Let's not fall out over what day it is. Let's not fall out over what you like to eat and what you don't. Let's unite on thus saith the Lord, because that's what matters. Verse 9, to this end Christ died and rose and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. So why do you judge your brother, or why do you show contempt for your brother? We shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Now, Paul makes a very strong point there, doesn't he? He says, that guy that ate the hamburger and the guy that ate only vegetables, and they refused to have anything to do with one another, they're both going to be standing before the judgment seat of Christ one of these days. And they're both going to have to figure out how to live so that is a favorable judgment. It's written, as I live, saith the Lord. And he quotes Isaiah 45 in verse 23. As I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So the guy that thinks he's holier than somebody else because he does or doesn't do certain things, he's going to have to bow down too. Everybody's going to have to bow in this last day. Everybody's going to be before God. Verse 12, then each of us shall give an account of himself. Do you think the word himself is significant in that verse, family? I'm so glad that Sherry's not going to have to give an account for me, because I'm afraid it would be more than she could carry if she had to answer for everything I've done. But I'm glad I don't have to give an account for anybody else. That's important in this context, because you have to work these opinion things out, because how well or how poorly you handle that is you're going to have to give an account for that. I'm going to have to give an account for what I said about a brother who didn't believe in eating in a certain place, or did believe in eating a certain thing. What I've said and done toward him, that's on me. That's on me. And that's what Paul's talking about. Verse 14, I know and am convinced by the Lord Jesus that there's nothing unclean in and of itself. Boy, could you see the hair raise up on the back of those Jewish people when he did that, when he said that? I am convinced there is nothing unclean in and of itself, but to him who considers it to be unclean, to him it's unclean. If it bothers the brother, then it's unclean. Just don't do it in front of him, and you'll get along fine. Now, does that sound like you're sneaking around doing something you're not supposed to do? No. It's going to offend this brother. It's not offensive to God. It doesn't violate his law. It's just offensive to a brother, a matter of opinion. Yet, if your brother is grieved because of your food, you're no longer walking in love. Do not destroy with your food the one for whom Christ died. Now we're back to the expediency and the right. Paul said in the Corinthian passages we read, I'm allowed to do a whole bunch of things. But it's not always wise to exercise that right, because it may cause a brother to lose his soul, a weaker person. So what do? I abstain for his sake. And then I walk around and tell everybody what I did. No. There's nothing wrong with eating a sandwich made out of this, this, and this, but it offends him, so I took the high road. I didn't do it. No. Nobody has to know you didn't do it. Nobody has to know. The brother for whom you made that concession doesn't have to know that you did it. Huh? Yeah, it does. And we're going to try to hurry and get down there. Bobby may have to teach this all over again. I may have messed it up so bad. Verse 15, if your brother's grieved because of your food, you're no longer walking in love. Verse 16, therefore do not let your good be spoken of as evil. For the kingdom of God is not, and I'm going to add a word here, not about eating and drinking. It's not eating and drinking, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. That's what we need to be concentrating on. For he who serves Christ in these things is acceptable to God and approved by men. Therefore, let us pursue the things that make for peace and the things by which we may edify one another. Boy, what a goal that is, isn't it? Pursue peace with one another and edify, build up one another rather than tearing one another down. On both sides, the weak and the strong. The weak, maybe if this brother's been in the church a long time and he doesn't have a problem with this thing that violates your conscience, maybe you need to think, I need to study that. I need to work toward growing in that area rather than just hanging on to it and saying it's never going to change. And it may never change. You may never change your mind about it, but you might. And so practice this thing yourself, but don't bind it on your brother. Do not destroy the work of God for the sake of food. All things indeed are pure, but it's evil for the man who eats with offense. Donnie pointed that out a while ago, verse 20. If it violates your conscience, don't do it. Don't do it until it doesn't violate your conscience. But don't stop the work of the church because of it. Don't be that fly in the ointment that every single time we come up with something, no, can't do that. Can't do that. Violates my conscience. I'm not there yet. I'm a weak brother. When were you baptized? 1967. Houston, we got a problem. If you haven't grown beyond being a weak brother in ever how many years that is, 52 years, then something's wrong. Way more than eating in a place where you're offended. And so, verse 21, it's good neither to eat meat nor drink wine nor do anything by which your brother stumbles or is offended or made weak. You don't want to do that. You don't want to ever cause your brother to be made weak. Do you have faith? Have it to yourself before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves. Man, we could do a whole lesson on that, couldn't we? Happy, blessed is the man who does not condemn himself in what he approves. You mean you condone that? Reminds me of Romans 1:32. It's just as bad to condone it, sin, as it is to participate in it. To make people think that you think it's okay. Then verse 23, he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because he does not eat from faith. Here it is. Here's the lesson of chapter 14. Whatever is not from faith is sin. If you can't do it with full conscience, full faith, be assured, then wait until you can. But don't stop the work of the church because you're struggling with something. Don't divide the Lord's body because of that. Unity among Christians is what this is all about. And ultimate judgment belongs to God. Practical applications, we have to set forth the principles. Sometimes it's a difficult task to apply these to real life situations. But it's not impossible. Paul wouldn't have given it to us if it were impossible. And so just be sure you're not the one stopping the work of the church over a matter of opinion or a weakness. Study and grow. Brother Tipton will straighten all this out next week.